Dear students, today in this short video, we'll be trying to understand decolonization. A number of questions have been asked from this topic, which is very dynamic and diverse also. In the last 7-8 years, not only in GS but definitely in optional. So this video is for history optional students, although GS students would also stand to gain a lot of it. And we'll try to understand some of the very ideological and analytical aspects of decolonization. This term decolonization was popularized in 1930s by a German Jewish thinker. His name was 1930s Moritz Julius Born. However, over the years, this term has been elaborated, explained, and many people, political leaders also like Kwame Nkrumah, even Lenin has written about decolonization. And in the modern times, we see the rise of post-coloniality. So they have analyzed not only the process, but how even after the grant of independence, transfer of power, how the society, mindset, economy, and to some extent the politics of the former colonies continued to be shaped by their colonial masters and their influences. So in this crisp video, we'll try to understand as far as possible the different dimensions of decolonization. First of all, what do we understand by decolonization? So if we have to give a formal definition to decolonization, then we would say that decolonization is a process associated with the withdrawal of control from its former colony or from its existing colony by a colonial power, followed by the transfer of power and attainment of political and economic independence. So I have tried to cover all the dimensions. So in this definition that I have just stated, there are a number of points to ponder over. First of all, it is a process. It is not an event. Although the transfer of power may happen with the signing of an agreement, or it can be a bargain, but it has been a process where a lot of negotiations have happened. So when we talk about decolonization, the decolonization is a process involving the transfer of power. Now here we will try to understand why are we emphasizing on these keywords. First of all, the transfer of power has been smooth in some of the colonies and it has been extremely violent and a prolonged process in other colonies. So when we look at this process, then we find that there is a lot of diversity. For example, if we leave aside the communal violence that happened, then the transfer of power was largely a negotiation between British and the Indian National Congress along with, say, Muslim League and other parties. This phenomena of negotiation we also find in terms of West Africa. So sometimes back UPSC had asked a question that in what ways the Western educated individuals like Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Alexander Crummell, Michael Delaney, all of them had played a very important role. Nkrumah, so he was an indigenous African leader who had taken the benefit of Western education introduced by the Christian missionaries. So it has been a peaceful process. It did not involve a war. However, we find that in case of Southeast Asia, it has been extremely violent. So we find that it has been a very violent process, a number of wars, a number of challenges, because decolonization, although the European powers, Clement Attlee had said in 1960 that decolonization was an act of altruism. It was the fulfillment of a self-assigned mission. So they have come up with this justification. All of us know about Rudyard Kipling's poem, Noble Civilizing Mission. So Clement Attlee, when the decolonization of the Third World was going on post Second World War, then the British tried to take the credit that we are doing it by our own mission, or it is an act of altruism, but it is not right, because even the British, French, Portuguese, Dutch, they have been reluctant to grant power to their colonies as far as possible. Despite the fact that there was a lot of pressure from the Cold War dynamics from US, still this reluctance was there, and this reluctance is one of the reason why after the Japanese withdrawal, Southeast Asian colonies waged a war of independence. So we have seen that it has been a violent struggle. It has not been a smooth process. We see this in the case of Indochina. We see this in the case of Indonesia. We see this in the case of Portuguese-controlled Timor Island. Transfer of power. If we look at transfer of power, then the transfer of power, it can be a phased process also. It can be one time, but it can be a phased process, especially in case of settlers' colony. So that is why I told you that decolonization is a very diverse topic where you have different case studies. The nature of decolonization in South Asia is very different from the nature of decolonization in Southeast Asia. Even in Southeast Asian colonies, there is a lot of diversity or differences or challenges. West Africa decolonization is different from that of Central Africa, from that of settlers' colony of South Africa. In the case of Latin America, it was different. In the case of North America, it has been different. So that is why I said that in some of the colonies, first of all, they granted self-independence, autonomy, legal autonomy or administrative autonomy, political autonomy, like in the case of Canada, 1897. And then they gave more freedom in 1931. Same is the case with South Africa. So we find that there has been a phased withdrawal of power. So in the case of, say, Australia, so many type of questions have been framed and will be framed based on these type of differences. Then when we talk about the transfer of power, the major challenge that decolonization also presented is transfer of power to whom? Because even in the case of India, where Indian National Congress had established its political legitimacy, there were rival claims and a number of partition plan had been proposed. And this situation became more complex in case of those colonies where there was a lot of, I would say, linguistic, religious and ethnic diversity. So this has been a challenge. Transfer of power to whom? And this, in case of diversity or in case of diverse population-based colonies, it has also resulted in post-decolonization violence. So we see that one of the important features of African colonies has been military coup. We see something that has been there, that has marred also the decolonization in Southeast Asia. So this has always been a challenge, and in some cases a leader would emerge, like Ho Chi Minh in the case of Vietnam. We find in the case of India, it was the Indian National Congress headed by Pandit Nehru. In case of Ghana, it was Kwame Nkrumah. However, it has not been always a smooth process. So first, try to understand that these are the aspects. Second, when we look at this process, the question is, when did it begin? When do we say the beginning of decolonization? Because let me tell you that we have seen at least 4 waves of decolonization. Because if we look at the general definition of decolonization, then decolonization is deconstructing colonialism or colonial authority. Withdrawal of foreign powers or withdrawal of those powers whose authority has been rejected by the masses. So that is why historians, many, especially Benedict Anderson, in his book Imagined Communities, where he discusses about the origin of nationalism, he has presented a elaborate chart, and he has mapped how did nationalism emerged. He has also spoken about how nationalism also has led to war of independence and how it has led to decolonization. So we find that historians agree that there have been 4 waves of decolonization, largely. Or if we study the history of decolonization, then we can say that it begins from, say, 1776 to 1820s in the New World. That is why Benedict Anderson has refuted this Eurocentric view that nationalism emerged in Western Europe in 18th century. In fact, he said that nationalism in France was in fact inspired by the nationalism of North American colonies, So during this period, we find that the settlers, they waged a war of independence, American War of Independence. The Creoles in the Latin American colonies, they fought against the colonial power. So it was a case of conflict between European settlers versus the European crown. So this is the first. Second, post World War I, 1919 to 1920s, where in the Paris Peace Conference a lot of discussion was happening about the political future of Europe, and Woodrow Wilson in his 14 points had mentioned the very important idea of principle of national self-determination. In fact, all of the historians agree that one of the fundamental principles which has guided decolonization and formation of nation states and state nations has been the principle of self-determination. Although it was selectively applied even in case of Europe and was never applied, at least at that time, in case of African and Asian colonies, but still we find that then when this principle was applied and there was fall of Ottoman Empire, it led to the creation of states. So for the Armenian Christians, it was a blessing. Then we find that after the fall of the Russian Empire, again new states who did not recognize Russian rule, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And then during 1930s and 40s, the Arab states which were placed under the League of Nations mandate system were also granted independence. So this was there, and the principle of self-determination was the guiding principle. Although this principle was violated also in case of Germans, in case of Magyars, but this is the second phase. So we find that before World War II, if at all communities gained independence from the powers which they rejected or resented, it was largely limited to the New World and Europe. The decolonization in the Third World, in Africa and Asia, it emerged post Second World. So realists have written that decolonization was not influenced by ideological, but it was influenced by geopolitical considerations. In fact, we find that John Darwin, he has written that international situations also influenced and they were responsible for decolonization post Second World War. So the third wave was post Second World War, associated with the fall of Europe and emergence of Cold War dynamics. So Cold War also played a role in the decolonization, and it also created complications and obstacles in the process of decolonization. This is also very interesting to be understood. And there was a power vacuum. So from here we see decolonization in the Third World or in Asia and Africa, but this was again not sudden. So for example, immediately if we see immediate transfer of power, then it was in the case of Philippines 1946, However, the transfer of power was not complete. So when we discuss about the transfer of power in decolonization, then another question, Kwame Nkrumah had coined the term neocolonialism, where he said that although the political rule has ended, but there is a dependency, which even the Marxist historians have written, that there has been an economic dependency, or the colonial masters have maintained economic control over their former colonies. Example, we see in many cases, US in Latin America, Philippines, which was granted independence in 1946, yet US continued to maintain its military bases. Recently, Denmark and the relation with Denmark and Greenland is in news. So Greenland is in many ways a Danish colony, but it enjoys considerable political administrative autonomy, but still is economically dependent upon Denmark. So these are all the cases. Immediate, we can say, in case of South Asia. Means in a matter of few years, it happened. Then in 1950s, 1960s, we see decolonization in Southeast Asia, which was a prolonged struggle. Indo-China region, in North Africa. So this reflects the degree of reluctance. So even if there was a lot of pressure, US, in fact, we find that in 1960, UN Resolution 1516, if you look at, then United Nations was also putting a lot of pressure. United Nations Resolution 1516 in 1960 condemned decolonization as a form of violation of human rights, and it also glorified and accepted the principle of self-determination. So UN was critical, Commonwealth of Nations was also critical of colonialism. In fact, the NAM platform or the NAM group also played an important role in the decolonization. It was also creating a lot of criticism. Despite this, it was a prolonged process. So Southeast Asia, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, all this, West Africa, and then 1970s, we see Portuguese. They were very reluctant. Portuguese started granting independence because of the pressure, international pressure that was building up. So if this is the third phase, and by the end of the third phase, which overlapped or coincided with the Cold War, most of the colonies at least attained political independence. However, the French continued to exercise considerable influence over West African colonies. So that is why one of the questions that has been raised and has been asked is that, is decolonization a myth for many of the colonies even today? And that is where we see that a number of new studies have also come up. The fourth phase, and in this phase we definitely see that all these international organizations, Cold War dynamics, all this played an important role. The fourth phase was after the end of Cold War and dissolution of USSR. So after this USSR, Soviet bloc was also called as a prison of nation. It means that not only communist governments were imposed and maintained by force, but people had limited choice with respect to their nationality. So that is why after the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, after Russia itself was in crisis and could not provide support, not only we see the fall of communist governments, but we also see disintegration of states. So after this we see split, like the Slovenians were not happy in Yugoslavia. Like the Croats and the Slovak realized that they cannot reconcile under one nation. So we find split or disintegration. Czechoslovakia. So basically, if we look at the introduction, if we try to understand the basic of decolonization, then we have to understand all this. And then definitely the next part comes, what are the factors which has influenced decolonization, or what are the important theories which is mainly for optional students associated with decolonization. So we'll look at the factors responsible for decolonization along with the various theories, which is important to quote and to apply some of these theories when you write answers with respect to any specific colony or a region. So what were the factors? Why did the colonial powers reach a point where they had to give away their source of advantage, their source of, to a large extent, prosperity in Europe was also based on the organized loot that was coming up from these colonies. So why did they do so? So there have been various approaches, various views have been given across the world. In India also, we see that nationalist historians have written about it. So because we'll try to take a larger view. So if you look at the decolonization, then the first is the nationalist theory, nationalist and modernist theory. DA law. So again, there are so many historians, but I also would advise students to limit yourself to one or two prominent historians, because it is not possible for you to memorize and not required also. So according to this school or these group of historians, decolonization was inevitable. I remember that we often use a quote by the French politician Turgot, who had said that colonies are like fruits, they cling on to the tree till they ripen. And this statement was made with respect to the inevitability of American evolution, which is also an example of freedom struggle or a colony. In fact, America, the 13 American colonies was the first colonies to successfully overthrow European colonialism anywhere in the world. So, according to the modernist, decolonization was inevitable and it was an outcome of the gradual socio-economic progress and the political maturity of the colonial people under the colonial masters. So they talk about that how decolonization was an organic process which was due to the changes that were seen in the colonial society and the mindset of the people when they realized the exploitation, when they realized what are their due rights, and they decided to come together. So this talks about inevitability. It talks about that it is an outcome of socio-economic progress and political maturity. Socio-economic progress and political maturity. Nationalists, they say that decolonization was not, or freedom was not given, it was taken or seized. So they emphasize on the important role of freedom struggle. They say that the role of national movements or freedom struggle, it can be both. Like Bipan Chandra has written that one thing that Gandhian movement had done, that they had demolished the myth of invincibility, because they had given the Indians a tool to work and maneuver within the British rule of law, British framework of law. So British rule in India, if we talk about India and then we'll apply to other areas also, British rule in India was characterized by legal authoritarianism, or Antonio Gramsci says it is semi-authoritarianism. So Bipan Chandra writes that Gandhian movement, one important role of Gandhian movement, if we apply it to this theory, is that he had created a situation where the British were feeling helpless. The myth of invincibility was eroded. And second, the Mai Baap image. So that is what the Indian national movement had done. The moderates and gradually all the other leaders had exposed that the British were essentially exploitative in nature. And then freedom struggle also, like in the case of America, like how the Southeast Asians fought against the French who were reluctant, like how the Indonesians from 1946 to 49, they fought against, headed by Sukarno. So they talk about seizure of power. Now here, sometimes some have critiqued that it was not actually a seizure of power, because the Europeans have said that they have presented the elite bargain theory, where decolonization was involved a lot of negotiation, and it involved a lot of understanding between the colonial elites. So this bargain, so this is also critical of the lack of involvement of masses. So colonial elites, colonial leaders and nationalist leaders, they have bargained. This essentially is seen in case of West African colonies, which was peaceful. In case of settlers colonies, Australia, Canada, South Africa. So one criticism of the elite bargain theory is that this decolonization was a decolonization for the top elite, not for the masses. Masses continued to be subordinated by these leaders. So there has been, like the case of Africa, South Africa, apartheid. So although Africa became independent in 1931, early 1930s, but then until apartheid was abolished, Africa itself, it suffered from what we can call as internal colonialism. Then role of geopolitics, especially after Second World War. So realists, they have said that decolonization was driven by power dynamics during Cold War and after Second World War, and it was not because of freedom struggle, or it was not an act of altruism. They were forced to, and they were lucky that they found an ecosystem, a situation which helped them in their decolonization. So historian like John Darwin, he says that let us analyze, I have already stated, let us analyze the situation after Second World War. Let us see that how US, which had even during the Second World War was going on, US had signed an agreement, an understanding with Britain, and that agreement also talks about discussing the politics of, or discussing the political future of the colonies, and wherever possible applying the principle of self-determination. That was the Atlantic Charter 1941. So we find that John Darwin says that after Second World War, most of the colonial powers, if you leave US and Japan, most of the colonial powers were Europe, but Second World War saw the beginning of a new world order in which there was fall of Europe, and there was emergence of two powers who wanted to dominate ideologically, economically, they wanted to dominate the world, and also they tried to resist each other's presence, communists versus the capitalists. So that is why the realists have said that in decolonization politics, we also see how US supported one group, especially in the case of Korean War and in the case of Vietnam War, versus Russia. So this has been a boon and also a bane. In some cases it has delayed, like in the case of Vietnam. It has delayed and complicated. Third, colonies as liabilities approach. So in some cases, this can also be applied in terms of India also. In some cases, historians like Anil Seal, Johnny Gallagher, they have said that in some of the colonies, the post-World War British, French, they found that it is difficult and it is more of a burden. Like one of the considerations for the British to leave India was the high debt that the British Indian government owed to the princely states, and they wanted to somehow transfer this burden to the Indians and leave gracefully. It was in fact one of the important context It was one of the important issues on which Clement Attlee had fought the election contested against Winston Churchill. So colonies as liabilities approach. Then we find that other views have also been given, not necessarily explaining decolonization, why it, but they have also spoken about decolonization, like the Marxists. Marxists like Lenin, Franz Fanon, they have seen the entire process of colonialism as associated, or they have hyphenated colonialism with capitalism. And they have also presented the dependency theory. So we find that they have presented the dependency theory, that how even after granting political independence, they continued to exercise significant economic influence. So Marxists, our other historians like Samir Amin, then Andre Gerth, all these historians have written about the dependency theory also. So this is also a very interesting school of thought. Another person, he presented the world systems approach. Immanuel Wallerstein. According to him, even after decolonization, the world economy has seen a lot of, I would say, disparity, and that disparity continues. In fact, this system approach, how it explains how the former colonial powers continue to exploit and they continue to benefit from their former colonies. So according to this world systems approach, the world economy is divided into core, where most of the colonial powers are. They are the developed nations. Then the semi-periphery, which continue to supply raw material and cheap labor. They are developing nations. And then the underdeveloped periphery, who supply raw materials and cheap labor to semi-periphery and to the core, but they also receive finished goods. So countries like India, countries like China, they have been exporting their goods to these. So they have come up with this approach also. Then post-colonialism, very interesting. In 1970s and 80s, we find that post-colonial theory has come. It is an intellectual framework which explains how even after decolonization, the colonial masters continue to influence, or in some case even shape, they continue to influence and shape the politics, society, economics, and even the psychology of it. They have tried to understand, they have tried to explain, and we find that there are many, like Homi Bhabha. He had presented the hybridity theory. He had presented the hybridity theory, according to which he says that the freed colonies, they exist in a space which is, culturally he says that it is a space which exists somewhere in between their indigenous culture and their colonial culture. So they have tried to maintain the roots of their indigenous culture, but they have significantly been modified and influenced by their colonial culture. So they are somewhere in between. Like see, in the case of Indians, we formally dress mostly in the British attire which they taught us. However, we have a love and we continue to speak our mother tongue. So this is something that have Edward Said, he in his famous work The Orientalism 1978, he was very critical of the Eurocentric approach, because he said that all the history that we have been studying, the history of modern world, is definitely it has been shaped by the Eurocentric approach, where the Europeans have presented the entire world from the kaleidoscope of Europe, and they have taken they have not only taken the credit, and they have justified colonialism as a means of civilizing, as a means of modernizing barbaric, uncivilized, orthodox, and then they granted independence also based on their own choice. So they have said that this is not the case. This is not the case. They have also changed the narrative. They have distorted the history. So we find that a lot of work is being done even now. A lot of work is being done even now. In fact, Gayatri Spivak, she representing the subaltern, has said that even in the post-colonial theory, if you look at post-colonial theory, some voices have largely been ignored. Some sections have not even been represented, or their role in the independence struggle or in the colonial history have not been given adequate importance, like the case of women. Like in India, it has been the case of Dalit. Then neo-colonialism, Kwame Nkrumah, they have said, he has said that decolonization is a myth. Economic dependency, and economic dependency through loans, granting aid, or sometimes giving conditional loan through IMF, World Bank. What is something that China is doing today? Checkbook diplomacy, debt trap policy. But China is not doing with respect to its colonies. China did not have colonies. It was not a colonial power. In fact, it itself was abused by European powers along with Japan. So we see that US has done that, is continuing to do it, and it is not limited to economy. They have also come up with a lot of political manipulations. They have tried to eliminate dissenters, and they have set up puppet governments. 1953, Iranian coup, President Mossadegh was removed by CIA. They have come up with so many covert operations, Reagan doctrine. So they have manipulated and they continue to manipulate. So that is why post-colonial theory, they have given a new dimension to decolonization. So this video was a very crisp one in which I tried to explain as far as possible. Otherwise, this topic is very diverse, which we tend to do in detail in our class, where we not only develop the superstructure, but then we go into area-wise, Latin America, South Asia, Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, also important countries. Then West Africa, South Africa, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. So please connect with us if you have any doubt. Thank you.